Thank you very much, Barry. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for inviting me to this Bruges Group meeting on the very important issue of out into the world, because I want to start by echoing what Graham said earlier, that centrally this is about recovering our power to govern ourselves. Now that's obviously very important politically. It's self-evidently important. The history of this country is one of self-government, and we have been a very bolshy lot when people have tried to boss us around. And thank goodness we have, because it's got us our ability to govern ourselves and to throw them out when we don't like what they're doing. And Graham emphasized that. I think it's absolutely core to the discussion. But it's also economically important, because if you have a government that you can throw out when it does things wrong, you can put in a government that learns from the mistakes of the previous government. And we can learn from mistakes, and we can get policies better. I mean, I think the history of this country's economic policies since the Second World War have been an interesting example of how we've managed to figure out how to make the economy work better. And we've thrown out governments, we got things wrong at various times, but we've learned from our mistakes, and we've generated a pretty successful economy with full employment and growth. Our living standards have risen above those of most of our European competitors as a result of the reforms we put in place and the way we've learned from our mistakes. Now you can try, that is what you might call a political economy point, because if you contrast that with a regime which is like an oligarchy, the EU. There's an oligarchy, a government by the few, the Euro elite, who, you know, as Roger Helmer says, because he lives with this as an MEP, they don't listen to us. They don't listen to many people. The Euro elite have a view about how Europe should go, and they've stuck to it. They created the Euro, which was a complete disaster, and has had the results in destroying the economies of several, you know, of the southern parts of Europe, as Graham pointed out. It's been a complete disaster. But is there any apology? Is there any reverse gear here? Do they listen? Do they learn? This is the biggest problem of the EU. It's an oligarchy that's driving its train, as Graham said, or was it Roger? I can't remember which. Both really. The point is that there is a project for Europe to build an architecture of greater a superstate, and nobody should take that not take that seriously. This is what they're going to do, and they're not going to listen to anybody. And we are, of course, as has been pointed out, in a minority. We have no chance of being heard, and so effectively we're in an organization that economically could inflict disaster on us without us being able to do anything about it. And the philosophy of the EU is one of regulation and intervention, and basically a sort of socialist philosophy. It's not really socialism, because in socialism you own the means of production. You nationalize things. And it's really socialish. I like to think of it as socialish, by which I mean that you pursue socialist objectives, or social, whatever you want to call social objectives, by regulation. Now, you know, Graham and I might disagree on how much regulation we should have of social matters, and he would probably want to have more than me. But in our democracy, we can argue about that, and we can think about how our citizens, you know, would trade the two things off and reach a compromise. In the European Union, we've no way of doing that. And that is why it is a disastrous system economically, as well as politically. not just for us, but of course the others have to look after themselves and think about it from their own viewpoint. But we know very clearly that we need a democratic system to, not just politically, as I say, but for economic reasons. And our economic history, I think, shows why that's so important. And I'm going to give some examples in a minute, and this table here is kind of like a summary table of the economic effects, the measurable economic effects of that Euro elite set of policies on us. And I'll talk about it. Now, against this requirement that we must have, and I think is broadly shared by all our people actually, whether they're pro-EU or anti-EU, pro-Brexit or anti-Brexit, we all actually would like self-government. I don't think this is contentious. But what has happened is that the pro-EU group have launched Project Fear. And Project Fear is about how we can't have self-government because of economics. This is an extraordinary set of propositions. First of all, Project Fear says, oh, the EU is fine because, look, we've managed okay, and it won't change. Not really. You know, all this stuff about ever closer union, particularly now we've had this Cameron renegotiation, doesn't mean it. Doesn't mean anything. But as both Roger and Graham have pointed out, this has no binding... there's no binding elements in this agreement that will prevent the oligarchy's plans for greater integration and the building of a superstate. We will simply, and indeed it's been pointed out as Roger pointed out, the French newspapers, the German newspapers have all confirmed that the project won't be affected in any way. So the first point that the pro-EU, the in-group say, is don't worry about being in the EU. There's nothing worrying. It's reassuring. It's the status quo, and we've managed so far. It'll be fine. And that's false, of course, because of what's been said. The second thing they say is if you leave, it's this leap in the dark, and huge costs, economic costs, will descend on you. This I find quite breathtaking because the work I've done over some 15 years now on what the effects of being in the EU are today, and in the era we live in, after the reforms of the UK economy and after the disastrous moves in the EU policies that were initiated by Monsieur Delors from the late 1980s. And it's important to have a sense of history here because in the 1970s, we were a pretty unsuccessful economy. We were the sick man of Europe. And the European common market, as it was then, was quite well run, actually. And it wasn't the centralized monster that it is today. Because that all changed in the 80s when we started to become a much more successful economy and grapple with our problems. And the European Union, having used Mrs. Thatcher to force through the single market, which we thought would be a good free market approach that the European EEC, as it was then, would adopt. Then Monsieur Delors effectively used the qualified majority voting that had come in through the single market to hijack the whole enterprise towards this oligarchic, union-building, euro-creating superstate. And so the French, as it were, kind of took charge and, I think, diverted the project. So the history of this whole thing is there's a kind of watershed moment of the late 80s when things turned very, very much topsy-turvy compared with what we had thought before. And that's really what my economic analysis focuses on. It focuses on the disastrous effects of this change by this oligarchy, effectively, or perhaps the fact that an oligarchy was allowed to get into the driving seat in a way that was unrestrained because it was so centralized after the 1980s. What that has done to the economy of Europe, and particularly to our economy, and what it could do in the future. And the first thing, really, turning to the costs that, being in Europe has forced on us and is likely to, and are likely to get worse, are the costs of protectionism. And everyone says the good thing about Europe is trade. But that's the bad thing about Europe. Because the problem of the European Union is that it is protectionist, quite seriously protectionist, and raises prices for consumer goods, particularly food, but also manufactures. Pretty much everything we buy in the way of manufactured goods and food is pushed up in price considerably by the European Union, roughly just under 20% in the present situation. Now, a 20% kind of rise in the costs of those things translates into a rise in the cost of living of not much less than that, about 16%. And so what this protectionism amounts to is a huge burden on our consumers. And effectively, our consumers are paying two bunch of people with this protectionist policy. They're paying our own protected manufacturers, and they're also, and our own farmers to some extent, but mainly they're paying French farmers and, German farmers and continental farmers, Polish farmers, and they are paying German car makers and other manufacturers, on the continent. So that's called a customs union. And what none of the people on the pro-EU side have admitted is that the EU is actually a protectionist organisation that distorts our economy and raises the costs on our consumers. And that's really the first item in my table. Obviously, the first item is our contribution to the budget, which was mentioned earlier, but that's pretty obviously a damaging thing for us. But go to the second item, which is the costs of this protectionism, the common agricultural policy and manufacturing. I mean, this is scandalous, really, that the pro-EU lobbies say that trade is so great when the truth is the exact opposite. The truth is the exact opposite. It's a burden on us. And that's why this session tonight is called Out of a Protected Europe, or something to that effect, and into the world. Because what we do when we leave the EU that's economically central is we abandon this protectionism by which we have to pay much more for goods from the rest of the world than we should, than we can get on the world market. We abandon it and join the world economy on the level playing field of world prices. So we get out, we sell to the world economy at world prices, and we buy from the world economy at world prices. And that's the central point. And then people say, oh, well, what happens if the EU charges us tariffs? Well, actually, we don't really care. We don't really care, because we're better off outside at world prices. We'll get world prices on what we sell to the EU instead of these inflated prices inside the tariff wall that the EU creates. And we'll buy stuff from the rest of the world at world prices much more cheaply. And on day one, the cost of living will come down substantially. We costed it on the basis that protection is a bit more moderate, maybe falls to 10%. I mean, who knows? It may stay up in 20, in which case the figures are even worse. But if you cost it on the basis of 10% protection inside this tariff and tariff equivalent wall, it's not just tariffs, it's also things like anti-dumping duties, it's threats of anti-dumping, it's quotas, there's all sorts of methods used to raise these trade barriers. It means the cost of living will drop 8% on day one. And that's a huge bonus to the British people. And that's central to the economic calculus. Of course, it's going to be opposed by all these, all these businesses that are protected. All the CBI, they would not like it. They don't like it up 'em. They will lose. They will lose. And of course, that's why big business, of course, which is tremendously benefited, these big businesses are tremendously benefited by the protection. And so they will make these points and they'll say it's a disaster. Well, I'm going to move, because we must finish my talk, I'm going to move rapidly through the other points because they're pretty familiar. I think we all know about regulation. We all know how, there's been this interference in our labour market. things like the working time directive, things like part-time rights for, full-time rights for part-time workers. I mean, the list is endless of the sorts of things that have distorted our labour market, and we've had to sort of try to get around. And we haven't really succeeded, but we've kind of muddled through. The reason the range here is from 6%, which is kind of where we are, to 25%, which seems like a lunatically high number, is because if these guys really took the kind of excesses of social intervention to the sort of preposterous limit that is possible, that a Labour Party here would never have done, because they brought in the minimum wage, but they put huge safeguards around it so it wouldn't affect jobs. But of course, if you're bringing in these regulations in a sort of spirit of social intervention, and you don't feel that you should show any limits, because anyway, it's probably not your economy that's going to be mainly affected, it's these Brits, you might do all sorts of things. And, there's all sorts of possible, very negative interventions that are possible, which is why you get that 25%. Rapidly moving on, bailouts and transfers. Well, I think the point is that although we do have an opt-out from the euro, what we have seen is that the project of, the European superstate requires essentially that everybody joins the euro, because that's the currency of the superstate. And I don't think in the long run, if we stay in, we will be bullied and bullied until some politician here, some majority, rather like Tony Blair gave up our opt-out from the social chapter, some government here would opportunistically give up the opt-out from the euro. I mean, from time to time this crops up, why shouldn't we join the euro? And it's easily possible to envisage a party, for reasons of party advantage, giving away something that's of vital importance to the British people. And if we did join the euro, the future of bailout and transfers, of course, beckons to us, as well as, I think, the possibility of shared income taxes and bailouts of other countries' pension systems, which are pretty rickety when you look at some of the stuff that's going on in continental Europe, where the retirement age is still in the low 60s, where here we realise we have to raise it, because you can't afford to keep on giving pensions to people who really, we need to continue working. So bailout and transfers is another element which could come back to bite us quite badly. And then we mustn't forget this all has an effect on our growth rate. I mean, look at the growth rate in Europe. It is pathetic. Europe has basically ground to a halt because of the terrible mismanagement of its economic policies, because of this politicization of everything, this drive for the superstate, the emphasis on the euro at any cost, the grinding down of southern Europe, all in the interests of kind of, this union. That has affected growth, and it could affect our growth rate. And the last point on my table is really that, it raises the volatility of our economy if you lose control of monetary policy. Now, I haven't really got time to, go through all the fallacies about the 3 million jobs and the loss of foreign direct investment. That's just straight economic fallacies. I mean, when you reform an economy the way we will reform ours when we get out of the bad policies of the European Union, you're always going to get change. I mean, about 1/5 of jobs die every year anyway and are replaced by new jobs. And so, obviously, though, those protected industries are going to contract and other industries are going to rise to take their place that are more suited to our, what we're best at. But that's all part of the normal processes of economic change when you reform an economy. And so this jobs point, I mean, actually more jobs will be created by a stronger economy than, of course, without it. And as far as foreign direct investment, I just mention this because you hear this so often, oh gosh, all the foreign direct investment that has come in because we're in Europe. But of course, if you have protected industries and they make a high profit because their prices are raised, people will invest in them. But if you withdraw that protection, there will still be investment in the other industries that would make a profit when the protection is taken away from the industries that are artificially, given profits. So there won't be a loss of foreign direct investment. There'll be a rechanneling of foreign direct investment towards the newer industries where our economy is naturally suited, where it can actually make an honest penny in world markets and not be cocooned by European protection. So that's enough from me. I just want to end by saying we can indeed afford self-government. In fact, we can't afford not to have self-government if we want a successful economy.